Now let's take a look at bone and calcium homeostasis. So bone growth and bone maintenance is highly affected by both nutrition and hormones. The nutrient calcium is especially important for bones, right? So make sure you're consuming your milk, your cheese, your dairy products, right? Your dark leafy greens like spinach and broccoli. Make sure you're getting enough calcium for proper bone health. Hormones also play a role, though, with bones too. Hormones that affect bones usually also affect the calcium levels in our bloodstream. So these are hormones like calcitriol, calcitonin, and parathyroid hormone. So bone homeostasis and the calcium homeostasis of blood are very closely tied together. First, let's take a look at the nutrient calcium. Okay? The digestive tract is the area of the body where we absorb our calcium from our food, specifically our small intestines. So the cells of our small intestine will pull the calcium out of our food and put it into our blood. Right? So now we have all of this calcium flowing through our blood. The nervous system and the muscles of the body get first dibs on the calcium, so they get first choice of all the calcium coming in. Once the nervous system and the muscles have their fill of calcium, any extra calcium will go to the bones, and then the bones can store that calcium. Once the bones have maximized their calcium storage, any excess calcium will be excreted from the body at the kidneys. So if we have too much calcium in the blood, the kidneys can pull the calcium out and put it into our urine. Usually doesn't happen. Usually we don't have enough calcium for that to occur. Now let's take a look at bone and calcium homeostasis. So there are two major hormones that are going to affect both bone and blood calcium levels. And these two hormones are calcitonin and parathyroid hormone. Now these are hormones, which means they're chemical messengers. So the job of a chemical messenger is to send a message to a cell. And hormones are able to do this by binding to receptors. So receptors are proteins either on the cell membrane or inside the cell that is going to be receiving the message. And once the hormone binds to the receptor, the message is sent to the cell. So the hormone calcitonin is important here. And the hormone calcitonin is going to be released by the thyroid gland, which is a large gland located in the cervical region. Parathyroid hormone is also an important hormone here. Parathyroid hormone is released by the parathyroid glands, which if you take that thyroid gland and turn it around and look at the back, you can see these little nodules in the thyroid gland, and those are parathyroid glands, and they produce the parathyroid hormone. Next up is parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone is made by the parathyroid glands. The parathyroid glands, like the thyroid gland, can detect the levels of calcium in the blood. When the blood calcium levels are low, we call that hypocalcemia. The parathyroid glands release parathyroid hormone. And this is a chemical messenger, and it travels through the bloodstream, and it primarily targets bone and kidney. When parathyroid hormone gets to the bones, it tells the bones to release calcium stores. So if we want to release calcium, we need to stimulate our osteoclasts. The osteoclasts are the bone cells that can break down the bone and release the calcium. Once the calcium is released, it's put into the bloodstream, which helps to increase the blood calcium levels back to normal. The other target for parathyroid hormone is the kidneys. And it has two functions here. The first function is to cause calcium to be saved from urine, what we call calcium reabsorption. So when parathyroid hormone gets to the kidneys, it tells the kidneys, don't pee out any calcium. Our blood calcium levels are already low. We have hypocalcemia. The last thing we want to do is pee out our calcium. Let's pull the calcium out of the urine and put it back into the blood, helping to increase the blood calcium levels back to normal. But there's another role that parathyroid hormone plays at the kidneys. Kidneys store another hormone that's involved here, calcitriol, which is our active form of vitamin D. Parathyroid hormone causes the kidneys to release calcitriol. So calcitriol is a hormone, it's released into the bloodstream, and its primary target is the small intestine. When calcitriol gets to the small intestine, it tells the small intestine to absorb more calcium from our food. So we're pulling in even more calcium out of our food and putting that calcium into our bloodstream. So like parathyroid hormone, calcitriol also helps to bring our blood calcium levels back up to a normal level. There are some other hormones that can be involved with bone. Growth hormone, for example. So growth hormone obviously is a hormone that causes your bones to grow. Okay? Estrogen and testosterone, we don't normally think of those as hormones that play a role with bone, but they do. These are what we typically think of as the sex hormones in females and males respective. Both of these hormones, though, are really important for maintaining bone mass throughout our lifetime. And a good example of this is looking at what happens after menopause in women. After menopause, women stop making estrogen, and the lack of estrogen can actually lead to osteoporosis. Last is the fibroblast growth factor, and this is sort of an unusual hormone, but it is important for bone growth. Some individuals have a mutated receptor for fibroblast growth factor, and this results in arms and legs being short, but the torso and head being of normal size. And that's because the fibroblast growth factor is primarily used to grow the appendage bones longer. This results in a condition called achondroplasia. Excuse me. This results in a condition called achondroplastic dwarfism or achondroplasia. An example of this is seen in Peter Dinklage, who plays Tyrion on Game of Thrones. Let's take a look at a few selected bone disorders, starting with osteoporosis. So osteoporosis is severe bone loss, and osteoporosis primarily affects the epiphyses of the long bones, the vertebrae in the vertebral column, and the jaws. And osteoporosis is something that usually happens later in life. And if you think about the epiphyses, the vertebrae, and the jaws, this kind of makes sense. So the epiphyses are the knobby ends of your long bone. You've probably heard that older adults, when they fall down, sometimes they break their hip. One of the reasons for this is because the epiphysis of the femur can be rather weak due to osteoporosis. You've probably also heard that as you age, you get shorter, right? I mean, originally when we start aging, we get taller, but then when we become much older, we become shorter. And this is because of osteoporosis in the vertebrae. So the vertebrae get smaller. Also, as our jaws become osteoporotic, our teeth fall out, right? So doesn't getting old sound fun? Osteoporosis affects women more than men, and this is because women go through menopause and they stop making estrogen, and the lack of estrogen can affect their bone maintenance. Men don't really have a menopause. Men do go through something called andropause, but they continue to make large amounts of testosterone even during that period, and so they don't often have as much of a problem with osteoporosis as women do. The best way to prevent osteoporosis is to maximize your peak bone mass, and this means to deposit lots of calcium into your calcium bank, and you have to do this early while you're young. So this is kind of like a 401k, right? You probably heard that you're supposed to start your 401ks, your savings for retirement, really early. The same is true for your storage of bone calcium. You want to maximize your bone calcium storage while you're young, because once you get to your 20s and 30s, you can't get any higher than what your peak bone mass was during those ages. So let's say the maximum peak bone mass that you achieved in your 30s was 65%. So this means that you'll never, ever, ever get higher than 65%. So you want to maximize that peak bone mass. You want to try to get as close to 100% as possible. And the way you do that is by consuming calcium-rich foods while you're young. Some other bone disorders. Gigantism is caused by excessive growth hormone being released before puberty. So before puberty, the growth plates are still growing, and by releasing lots of growth hormone at the growth plates, the bones can grow really, really, really long. Individuals that have gigantism often die very young because their cardiovascular system can't maintain the necessary blood flow for their large body size. Acromegaly is excessive growth, mostly of the hands, feet, jaws, and skull, and this is caused by excessive growth hormone after puberty. So after puberty, most of your growth plates are closed, but some of your bones can still grow, like the hands, feet, jaws, and skull. Andre the Giant, shown in the picture here, had acromegaly. He actually had gigantism too, but he did have acromegaly. And then there's dwarfism. There's different types of dwarfism. Pituitary dwarfism is caused by inadequate growth hormone before puberty. We pretty much have most of this taken care of, though. If someone gets a diagnosis of pituitary dwarfism, basically they can be given growth hormone supplements, and that can pretty much eradicate the pituitary dwarfism. Achondroplastic dwarfism is the type of dwarfism that is caused by a mutated receptor for the fibroblast growth factor hormone. These individuals can't receive the fibroblast growth factor hormone, and so this primarily affects the bones of the arms and the legs. So the arms and legs are shorter, but the torso and head are of normal size. Peter Dinklage from Game of Thrones has achondroplastic dwarfism. This is sort of a strange bone disorder. It's known as fibrodysplasia ossificans progressiva. It's also known as heterotopic or ectopic bones. Ectopic means misplaced. So these are misplaced bones growing in places where they shouldn't. So sometimes bones can start to grow in our muscles or in our connective tissues. Thank goodness this is not very common, because as you can imagine, it's a very painful disorder and it highly limits mobility. Other bone disorders include abnormal spinal curvatures. Most of you are probably familiar with what we see in letter C there. That's scoliosis. Normally our vertebral column should not have a sideways curvature at all, and that's what we refer to as scoliosis. Now, looking at A, you can see how the lumbar region of the vertebral column is excessively pushing forward. There is supposed to be some anterior curvature to the lumbar region, but in A, this is excessive, and this is what we call lordosis. In B, there's excessive posterior curvature of the thoracic region of the spinal cord, and this is what we call kyphosis, which is also known as hunchback.